Welcome back to Upside Down Data. Let's talk about Polygon and its native token MATIC. All right, so I'm not going to sugarcoat it. MATIC has been somewhat disappointing this market cycle. If we just measure from the 2023 lows to as high as it managed to get, only up about 157%, and maybe more concerningly, only up about 33% off of the lows. So certainly far behind a lot of the competitors in the altcoin space. And we'll see that MATIC didn't even manage to break above its 2023 local high, to say nothing of getting close to its prior all-time highs. So what I want to do is first talk about what some of our models are seeing for MATIC and what they're thinking about this price action. Then I want to zoom out and talk about some broader factors that can put into context this relative underperformance by MATIC and why it maybe makes sense and how we can think about those dynamics going forward. So let's go ahead and start off by talking about our models. I want to start off by talking about the short-term upside downside potential indicator. Is a short-term risk model that we have here at the channel. Higher values mean high risk, lower values mean lower risk. And you see it does a good job of reacting to the shorter term volatility and giving a good sense of when local bottoms might be near or forming, as well as local tops, if not the top. And what you'll notice looking at this chart is that we've kind of been in a range on the short-term UDPI for quite a while, with the tops tending to happen just a bit below 0 or just getting up to maybe at best around 1 or a little bit below 1. Then the bottoms tending to form at this lower range down here as well, at least the local lows. So when you look at current levels of the short-term UDPI for MATIC, it is interesting that we are so low. Historically speaking, these levels do not tend to happen very often, and they do tend to market notable local bottoming points. I mean, really, the last time we've seen levels this low, you have to go all the way back to, for example, back here in June of 2023, maybe somewhere around here in June of 2022, and then, of course, all the way back here to 2020 before you see levels that low. So historically speaking, this does seem like a reasonable place to think that MATIC might at some point soon, and at least in the short term, find a local low to be able to have at least some mean reversion back to the upside. Now, we'll have to wait and see for some confirmation before getting too excited about that, but certainly it seems like that's possible. It's in a pretty extreme place right now, and generally speaking, those extreme values do not tend to last super long before you have some rebound to the upside. So obviously not financial advice, you should make of these data as you will, but historically speaking, that's the way that I am seeing it. This does seem, historically speaking, to be a relative value zone, or at least a sign that a local bottom might form soon. So that's the short-term perspective from this model. Let's talk about the longer-term perspective. This is the long-term UDPI. So it cares about moves that play out over months to multiple months, longer term in its focus. And you can see that it doesn't react really so much to that shorter-term volatility and really is trying to get at the bigger sweeping moves that MATIC has experienced. And you'll notice that going into where we are right now, we're coming off of relatively high levels up here and especially over here. And we're now dipping down into these relative value zones. And again, we're getting closer and closer to values like here, back over here, and back over here that marked local bottoms, or at least value zones before some mean reversal happened in that kind of longer term perspective. So we still could easily have more room to fall here before we really get back into that zone. But again, would not shock me if we do enter into that zone, if we're not already there, fairly soon, to then mark a notable local bottom. Again, assuming that the bull market is still on, of course, assuming we're not just going to fall off a cliff and the stock market's going to crash or anything like that. So that's what I'm seeing right now from these risk models, that both in the short term and in this longer term perspective, a local bottom forming soon would make a lot of sense, though, of course, there's no guarantee that it has to happen immediately by any stretch of the imagination. But soon, I'm going to be watching this very closely, and especially I think if we start seeing things flip more bullish, other signs flip more bullish, might be a reasonable indication that the local bottom might be in for a bit and we have some mean reversion to the upside. Now, another model that we can look at to give us a sense of where is MATIC in the market cycle is our momentum bias indicator, or MBI. So as the name suggests, this cares about momentum. And is momentum biased to the upside, or is it really biased to the downside? So in bull markets, you tend to get this kind of behavior here, where you spend a lot of time in the green and not so much in the red. Bear markets the opposite, a lot of time in the red, not much in the green. But then when you see this kind of oscillation pattern here, or like here coming out of a bear market, that can indicate that transition where we're in a bear market and you're now transitioning into a bull market. Now, what's notable about MATIC is it has spent a long time doing this kind of oscillation, kind of coming out of this bear market. It actually even arguably had a mini bear market after the merge going down here after the Ethereum merge, where it kind of, a lot of the hype of that bled over into MATIC, given that MATIC is very much linked to Ethereum in its narrative fit. They have had a mini bear market, and now we've been sort of trying to reestablish a bull market, but not really been all that successful so far. So there are different ways we can think about this, right? One of them is that MATIC has just struggled to maintain positive momentum bias. So unlike what we did back over here, and we had this massive explosion in price, MATIC just really has not been able to do that so far this cycle. And so the possible positive spin of that is that it's doing the same thing it did back over here, is that just spending a long time kind of in this new accumulation range here, and that eventually in a bull market, it will do something like this, and maybe it will wait longer than other assets. What's notable is that when MATIC ran so heavily here, it really waited fairly late compared to a lot of other assets. By the time it even started moving here, Bitcoin had already moved up massively in that time. A lot of other alts had already started running. MATIC was slower, and it didn't peak out in that bull market until all the way in late May, quite a bit later than a lot of other assets in the crypto space. So one possibility is that the same thing might be playing out again, where MATIC is just biding its time, reaccumulating, and maybe it will run later than some other assets. Though I personally am not going to be making too strong of any claims about that, because one data point is not much to extrapolate off of. Just because it happened last cycle does not mean it has to happen this current cycle. But I do think it is an interesting thing to keep an eye on. So when I look at MATIC, what I'm seeing right now is the definite possibility from the data that I'm seeing of a local bottom forming right here. But that doesn't mean we're just about to rip to the upside like we did here. What I'm actually seeing for the MBI is more of an indication that we're just still in this reaccumulation zone, and that we might expect some bounce here, but I'm not going to be getting too excited about just ripping off to new all-time highs until we see a little bit more to point us in that direction. So far, I might just expect mean reversion, maybe to the higher end of the range, rather than really being that catapult up to the, up to the upside. We'll have to see how that plays out. But now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some broader factors we can consider to think about when is it possible that MATIC could really go crazy, and should we actually think this cycle might be a little bit different based on the context we find ourselves in. So let's go ahead and start talking about those things. Okay, so the first thing I actually wanted to talk about here was how MATIC tends to actually follow Ethereum quite closely. And I think this is important because obviously MATIC has narrative fit with Ethereum. If you're not familiar, MATIC is very much a part of the layer 2 narrative, where basically protocols try to build on top of Ethereum to leverage Ethereum security, but then they can also be more scalable than Ethereum. And MATIC is kind of one of the old school, been in there a long time kind of narrative fits with that narrative, the L2 narrative. And so given that, it tends to follow Ethereum closely. So like, for example, when Ethereum had the merge and rallied up pretty high over here, that's the exact same time that MATIC also saw a lot of price appreciation up through here. And so Ethereum has been moving up, but it's been underperforming the likes of, for example, Bitcoin. It has not put in a new all-time high yet. Bitcoin has. And generally speaking, Ethereum has not been performing as well as Bitcoin. So from that perspective, you might think that's reasonable to think that MATIC would also perform not so great. And we can just look at this from a more purely data-driven perspective also. What I'm showing you here is the 200-day correlation between MATIC's price, I just have the MATIC price here, and Ethereum's price, which is the orange line here. What you can see is that there are brief times where there is this deviation where they actually are negatively correlated, but by and large, throughout their whole history, MATIC has been pretty highly correlated with Ethereum, getting all the way up to above 0.9. If you're not familiar with correlations, they go from 1 to -1. 1 would be a perfect positive correlation, so 1-for-1 movement to the upside would be movement to the upside for the other one. -1 would be perfect correlation in the opposite direction, where one moving up means the other one's moving down. So to see it this high, above 0.9 in a correlation, that's pretty extreme. And that's just one of those things where, again, until Ethereum maybe starts doing something more impressive, maybe we won't really expect MATIC to do anything especially impressive. So this could be a matter of waiting, for example, that if maybe Ethereum gets a spot ETF at some point, maybe not in May, a lot of people don't think that's going to happen, but maybe down the line from here, then maybe that would be that catalyst that not only brings Ethereum to the upside, but then brings along a lot of the things that kind of follow in its wake or kind of fit into its narrative, where MATIC, I think, very much would find itself. So that's one thing that we can keep in mind. Maybe one explanation for the relative weakness MATIC has been showing more recently is that it's so tethered to Ethereum, the fact that Ethereum's also been underperforming maybe MATIC as well. The other thing, though, that I think is really important to talk about, and especially in a bull market where narrative means much more than anything else, more than fundamentals or anything else, because obviously people point out how MATIC the proof of stake chain is actually not a layer 2, and that is true. But that doesn't matter in a bull market. I think that's important to clarify. It's the narrative fit that matters, not the actual underlying reality. So I think that MATIC is very much going to chart the layer 2 narrative, even though technically the MATIC network itself is not really a layer 2. It's more of a sidechain. But Polygon is very intimately involved in the layer 2 narrative. They do a lot of stuff with zero knowledge rollups. They've been one of the big pioneers of that, which very much fits into that layer 2 narrative. But what's important here, and a contextual thing that might be a little bit different than last cycle, is that there's just been a massive explosion in layer 2 so far. So to this point where we're now getting talk about layer 3 protocols that will try to stitch together different layer 2s. And just in this article that I'm showing here, they cite a number where there are more than 40 layer 2 blockchains already built on top of Ethereum, with another 35 in development. What that means is that there's a big amount of dilution in the layer 2 space that is happening, and that's not the way it was last cycle. Certainly MATIC was not the only thing in the layer 2 narrative, but it wasn't the case you just had everyone building a layer 2. And that's more or less been the kind of the case for the last year or two. Just so many layer 2s coming out and so many more being built. And what that means is that if someone wants to place a bet on that layer 2 narrative, MATIC is no longer the necessarily obvious choice. There are many other ones that have way smaller market cap that are out there that someone could bet on, which maybe have higher potential upside. And so that means is that the interest in MATIC might be less acute than it was last time around. If people are wanting to ape into the layer 2 narrative, will they choose MATIC? Maybe, but maybe they'll choose any of the other number one of them that are out there. Maybe they'll choose Optimism, which now has a token. Maybe they'll choose Arbitrum, which now has a token, so on and so forth. And so that's one of these things where I think MATIC might have a little bit of difficulty, or some things might have to happen to really make it the obvious choice in that narrative for that particular narrative to be the thing that catapults it further. Now, obviously, if MATIC does a lot of its own things that are unique and maybe can fit into other narratives or even create its own unique narratives to itself, then it could kind of detach itself from that and maybe just really appreciate beyond anything like that. But I do think this idea of dilution of the layer 2 space is just something that's useful to keep an eye on. And there's no guarantee that it has to, make a huge difference. Maybe people do just go back into MATIC as being that play. But it is certainly a difference between now and last cycle, and maybe is feeding into this relative weakness that instead of people just buying in MATIC, which is already a pretty large market cap asset, they're betting on the more speculative, smaller market cap assets that maybe have more upside potential if those narratives really pick up. So then when I'm kind of looking across all of this, when I'm looking at the different data that we have and the fact that MATIC tends to really closely follow Ethereum, and then also its connection to the layer 2 narrative, the one thing that this kind of leads me to believe is that in the short term, I'm personally not too optimistic of us just ripping the new all-time highs for MATIC. I think that we have a ways to go before we get more optimistic of that, though I do think in the short term, and maybe even the longer term, a local bottom forming before too long could make sense. But I think maybe the best that we can hope for is just a continuation of the accumulation zone for a while, and then whenever that catalyst comes, maybe that's when it can launch off, assuming it can capture enough speculative interest within and beyond that layer 2 narrative, where again, there's a lot more competition now than there was before. So those are some of my thoughts about where MATIC is right now, what we might expect for it going forward, and the context that might help explain its relative weakness in this cycle. So if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us over on X. A lot of updates from our models and more over there. And you can go to our website, claritydigital.io, link in the description, for more data from our models and more.